It's said that a master architect would always give the advice to his students that when they were done with the mock-ups and the drawings to go ahead and take a step back and see how the building fits on that block. Take a few more steps back and get a sense how it visualizes within the neighborhood, and then try and pull back even farther and see how it nestles into the city. On today, we get to speak with Frank Romo, an educator, GIS specialist, mapmaker, fascinating character, and a guy that very much gets this idea of pulling back and seeing how your work impacts its surroundings. You might almost call him a meta mapper in a way. The interesting thing is he has eyes on getting you, the listener, involved in his maps as well. What follows is a portion of a conversation with Frank Romo. We came across and started posting a project of yours a few months back, which was the Black Lives Matter online map. Again, this is kind of the unknowable event that's happening in 2020. It feels huge here. It feels huge for us. But the map that you provided gave so much reassurance that, oh, we're not an anomaly, because all of a sudden, Oglala, Nebraska, Pecos, Texas, all the way through New England and the West Coast, all of them were experiencing the same thing. How did you come up with an idea, and how did you begin to think of how to visualize this?
Well, I think it starts from, if I may, it starts from, my background as community organizer and activist. I've been a long time organizer and activist, grew up in Los Angeles, California. And while I was living there, I did a lot of work in local community to fight for civil rights and for better access to healthy food, and fight against environmental toxins in the neighborhood, and things like that. So I have a background in organizing, and a lot of my research actually is focused on this idea of race and policing and the intersection of those. I did a master's thesis at the University of Michigan that focused on race and policing and urban space. So I'm very familiar with the topic. It's very something that's very close to my heart as well. So when things started to occur after May 25th, 2020, after the George Floyd incident, there was just something that clicked in my mind where, again, because I'm familiar with the data, because I follow these kind of movements, because I know people who are actively engaged in the movement, I work with community organizations in the movement. There was just something this time around that felt very different. And, I've watched this happen, unfortunately, over and over again in my home city of Los Angeles, across the nation over the past few years. And this time it was just something felt different. Almost immediately you saw the major cities pop up, right? And you kind of see this wave, right? LA, Chicago, New York, DC, cities with large populations, people of color, but also with folks who probably have had, where you have some difficult community and police relations. So, you would expect those cities to kind of pop off the map and voice their opinion and speak out and protest and demonstrate. But then, the next day came and the next day came. And as you mentioned, there were protests that appeared in places like Nebraska and South Dakota and smaller cities here in Michigan. And so when you started to see that, I was like, something might be going on a little different. And then, you get into day 3 and day 4, and all of a sudden it wasn't slowing down. It was ramping up. And, a lot of it culminated that first weekend, that within that first 7 to 10 days, there was just so many. And I just said, hey, this is happening. I could feel just from my experience as an organizer and being in the movement, I was like, this is different. Something's happening different here. So I got to my analyst and I said, let's go track these down. And we had used some Twitter information. We used scraping of websites, and we used any information that was available to us to kind of get all of these pieces, right? Because we wanted to get the latitude and longitude. We wanted to get local news source because, again, we could find information on LA, Chicago, New York, but,
but
smaller cities.
Yeah, my favorite was Halifax, Nova Scotia, or St. John's in Newfoundland. They too,
right?
We're having protests,
right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so it started so that's where we ended up leading up to, is going worldwide, because we saw some of these popping up in small cities across the U.S. And So we did, our due diligence. We pulled information from social media. We pulled information from local news sources. And then as far as the mapping interface goes, one of the things that was really implemented at the very beginning was the crowdsourcing piece, because we realized that we just didn't have the bandwidth to map all of these and verify all these. And me, as a map maker, I'm very diligent. And so, I wasn't going to put something on the map where we didn't have a source, where we didn't have something that was very clear about where we got our information from, because I don't want to mislead folks. Right. So we found all the, 100, 200, 400 as it expanded, all these locations. And then we went to each little city and said, okay, let's find a local newspaper, because again, the local media has better understanding of the context in which this is happening, and can provide us, better feedback than maybe if it was in 2 or 3 cities surrounding the major capital. Then, the capital, or, let's say here in Michigan, Lansing, right? There was protests there and in Detroit and in some of the major cities. But, what about the smaller cities, and how do we find out what's actually going on there? And again, the context there is very different, because in some cases, these were a lot of allies who were speaking up in some of these cities, which are, were predominantly not people of color, and predominantly folks who maybe have not participated in this kind of action or movement before. That's where I think we saw the real, whoa, or the aha moment, where it was like, wow, there are thousands and thousands of people who are standing in solidarity with this movement. And then, as it progressed, I started to stay up to 2 or 3 in the morning to kind of watch how things were going. And sure enough, there was stuff going on in Australia and in Berlin and on all these different continents. And I was like, wow, this is really happening. So that's kind of how we got started with the project.
And it harkens back for me too. Well, I suppose the beautiful thing is this is something that's indicative of our age and can apply a different texture of understanding to things that had never existed before. I think, in the past, it was one of those things where, in the late 60s, early 70s, there might have been turmoil and bombings and fires and this, that, and the other. But Walter Cronkite's not going to report that to you, that happened in Saskatoon. He's not going to mention what happened in rural Idaho. But all of a sudden, when you have a layer of understanding that expands, it's the old cliche of sometimes a capacity of a greater number ends up becoming something totally different. Once you reach kind of this critical mass of an amount, it takes on a whole different quality of impact. But also, it kind of takes on a whole different historical significance, which in the past we never had the tools to kind of collect and display the information all in one place, which is a huge difference.
Right, I agree. I agree 100%. I think you're absolutely right about that critical mass, and I think that's kind of what I felt kind of in my bones or in my thought process. I was like, whoa, this is going towards a peak of a critical mass, and that's when I knew that we needed to start documenting it. And to your point, in the past, we didn't have some of these technologies, so you would get the reports of Chicago, New York, LA, but Sioux Falls, South Dakota, or wherever else, you might not be able to know that even happened. Yeah. And if you're not in tune with it or know somebody who lived there, and now it's different. And so one of the things we wanted to do was also provide the opportunity to crowdsource information, because as I said, we didn't have really the bandwidth to keep up as it was happening. Yeah. And so on the map, we allowed folks to click on a point either 2 ways. We allowed folks to either click on an existing point that didn't have validation, for instance, didn't have a news source, didn't have other information. For instance, we had a hunch, we had a lead that there was a protest or a demonstration there, but there was no valid source. So we had the point there and allowed folks to click on the point. Then it redirected them to a survey, and they were able to give us information. Hey, do you have an image? Hey, do you have a source? And we gathered gathered information that way. And then the other option was, hey, click on this button and add a point to the map. And we allowed folks to add a point to the map. And in doing that, it was the same idea. Do you have an image? Do you have a date? Do you have a source? And in that way, we were able to kind of double up. We had our analysts working internally to spot check and verify, while at the same time we were trying to collect data from folks who were actually out there. And I think, to your point about this critical mass and this technology, one of the things that we really felt was that the technology really allowed people to feel more engaged, because whenever somebody looks at a map, the first thing they do is look at their home or their city or some place that they're familiar with, right? It's a part of orienting themselves, but it's also a part of, hey, this is what I'm interested in. So I think
this is my experience.
Absolutely. And so by putting the points on the map or allowing folks to put their own points on the map, it allows them to feel empowered about participating in that demonstration or showing their support for that movement, because some folks might not be out there in the streets, but they might be documenting it and might want to help document it. So just like with any other movement, everybody has their own role. And so for me, I felt that my role was to try to bring folks together, show them the visualization, and try to engage people in whatever way they could. So if they wanted to submit photos, if they wanted to submit new points on the map, they could do so. And then the goal is that everybody can look back and say, hey, look, that I added that point to the map, or hey, I was at that protest in, Birmingham, Alabama. I was at that protest. There's a sense of pride. There's a sense of also this historic moment, like, hey, I was there. And I think that brings a lot of folks together in solidarity.
For me, it's still that whole thing of breadth. I mean, it's true that quantity makes a different quality. But the thing for me is it always gets down to, well, it's easy enough. Oh, it's, those cities, they're just rebellious and they just, there's always problems in cities. Well, this contradicts that. It contradicts the fact that this is just some small urban problem that people complain about. This starts to stretch it out, and it's rolling it open to a level, I think, that's uncomfortable but was never perceived in the past. And that's, two, I think we get down to legitimizing people's experience in the urban setting. Another project that you guys produced related to Detroit is as one that still has family in the Detroit area, I am very sensitive when Detroit slander happens. And I have to say, it's a lot more complicated, and people's lives are a lot more complicated. We always seek to kind of boil things down and make it simple and black and white. But the texture and quality of life, how the kind of warp and woof of things intertwine, is a lot more complex. You did a murals project in Detroit, and it always hits me when you think of, especially young people, that this becomes the iconography that imprints itself. This is what you see on the bus. This is what you see going to work. This is what you see when you're coming home from school. And these all become points in your life that are geographical reference points. And can you talk a bit about how you came up with this idea? Because this gives you, if you want to get into the skin and deep into Detroit and understand, look at its art. Look at the aesthetic that it kind of wraps itself in. How did this get going?
Absolutely. I appreciate you bringing up that. I mean, everything you said is absolutely right. I think these images of the city and of people's daily lives become part of who they are, right? If you ask somebody to draw a mental map of their neighborhood or their route to work, they'd probably put that mural on the map. It's somewhere here and it looks kind of like this. One of the things that I always do with my students is have them first draw a mental map of their neighborhood to see like how they envision themselves in the urban space, et cetera. So I think that's absolutely right. You see these things every day. It tells a lot about the artist. It tells a lot about the people. It tells a lot about the heart of the city. And me coming from Los Angeles, very similar. I think folks get taken aback when I say this, but I say it a lot, is that Detroit reminds me a lot of Los Angeles. And, it's sprawling. It's very car-centric. You have these murals everywhere. There's a lot of commonalities there. And so being from Los Angeles, I saw a lot of murals, and also even in my community, in Mexican-American community, murals are very much a point of pride and a point of showing your ethnic background, showing your heritage, showing your history. Yes. And you see that here in Detroit as well, where you have folks who are showing their history, showing the history of the city, showing the victories through people who have been part of the civil rights movement, who have fought for justice. And, there are points of empowerment. And one of the reasons why I did the project in Detroit, the Murals in Detroit project, was because murals in themselves have a transient kind of property because they are on buildings that may not, whoever the artist may be, it is often unlikely that they own the building which they are painting on. And what that entails is that if somebody sells the building, somebody decides to paint it, or something happens to the building, if it gets demolished, all of a sudden that art is gone. And now that mural that you've seen every day going to work for the past 5 years is gone when you go to work. And how does that make like a community member feel? I know for me, I'm like, oh man, I really loved that mural. I'm sad that it's gone.
Yeah, and which starts getting us back to that whole thing of cities and those kind of layers of change that happen. As you kind of address it building to building, but, as we've been seeing, repeopling, gentrification, however you would like to term it, you end up with these kind of washes of people groups that kind of come into a city and wash out. Some that endure and impact, and then others that kind of, I guess that was the thing with the murals map, was all of a sudden, for me as an old head, when I saw images of Mr. Malcolm, or if I saw Dr. King, there was something deep down that really felt grounded to me. It really kind of, it made me feel stable at home. Or the one that really caught me was somebody had done a mural and it included Aretha and then her dad, C.L. Franklin, the late great minister. And there was something that's like, that's the deep roots. I understand when younger heads want to come in and do like a cool geometric pattern with contrasting colors. But for us, I guess for older people like myself, it's the thing of seeing Jesus next to Harriet Tubman, next to Dr. King, and so on and so forth. And that was, to me, was the thing of a storytelling that you would never get, just by walking the streets. And maybe as neighborhoods change, the people that were rooted in that understanding, maybe that leaves too. It seems like you've made something that really, it's about art, but it's also about time and people moving. It's about all those changes, which I guess, just say LA, if you want an instance of a city that's constantly remaking itself.
Absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right. The project tries to, we wanted it to be fun. We wanted it to be exciting, and we let folks take pictures, and they can hashtag murals in Detroit and things like that. And then we can add it to the map. And I mean, you can see though, this is kind of also where that kind of crowdsourcing idea comes from. Like even in the protest map, it bleeds through because again, with the protests, with the murals, with the artwork with regards to the Black Lives Matter movement, we added that to the protest map afterwards because it all kind of blends together, right? There's this history, and I'm an urban planner, but I consider myself very much a geographer. And there's this history of space, right? The actions, the fight, the struggle, the overcoming of certain things that happen in those spaces need to be recognized. And the murals, the maps, what we try to do is try to acknowledge that and kind of commit it to collective memory. Because as you've said, with regards to the murals, if there is a change in population and all of a sudden somebody wants to take a mural down, that one of the ones that I was really sad that came down was, famous boxer Joe Louis. There was a real nice mural of him, and it's no longer there. It's a new painting, but it's for like an advertisement. And I was really sad to see that go. And I'm not from Detroit, but I know who Joe Louis is, and I know that he was a great impact on this city. And to see that go, I was like, oh man. But what made me happy was that we cataloged it, and I have that image forever now on the site. And it's great to be able to say, hey, we still have, this history is still here, because you never know what that kind of image of somebody who has overcome, of somebody who is a champion, of somebody who has succeeded. You never know what those kind of visual cues, how they could inspire somebody, or how they could change somebody's life,
or how they can hamper someone. We've had discussions about, especially, and listeners don't take this wrong. I think in some older countries, especially, there is a batch of iconography of old titans of industry, of people that were ridiculously wealthy and made some beneficial donation. And they become the people that indeed those statues start to turn into almost a weight. I can't see myself as a titan of industry. I would love to build a library for someone, but at the same time, it feels like there needs to be almost a process of kind of, can we diminish some of the past things that don't fit the present model? They don't fit the present circumstance, and be able to move on, still utilizing, we're not trying to edit history, but can we have something that's progressing in the direction of beneficial for everybody, but also specific to us? I always love that when authors or filmmakers will make the comment that they're so stunned that they'll realize that it's when I started getting really detailed and unveiling stuff about my own self, that's when people started to understand me. It wasn't by generalizing that you were able to reach an audience, but it was by being super specific that you could make connections with other people. And I guess that's a piece of what I get out of the mural project was it's so specific that you start to feel the people behind it. And not in that kind of just neutral, we should do something on this wall type way, but it starts to convey life. I guess, what you've really done is you've kind of pointed to, you've started to make maps this meta tool. You've started to use it almost as, I don't know, it's beyond television, it's beyond anything, because it's getting into the specifics of people, but then giving us something transcendent at the same time. How do you do that? Exactly. Because it's pretty impressive.
I appreciate that. I mean, that might be the kindest compliment I've ever had. So I appreciate that because, I mean, maps, let me say this, one last thing regarding the murals is that you're absolutely right. I mean, murals in themselves, like, how they have come about and things like that, they are exactly what you're talking about. They are of the people, right? Mm-hmm. They are from the experience, the lives, the background, things that the people value in that community are what go up on the murals. And so, it's not just about, hey, this is a beautiful image of Dr. King. Hey, this is a beautiful image of Aretha Franklin. Hey, this is a beautiful image. It's about a sense of pride, and it's about a sense of like, yeah, those are our people, and that's what we stand for, and those are the values that we like to uphold. And I think that in that same way, mapping is a visual representation in any other way, as like you said, in another medium, as in TV or in websites or anything like that. Mapping is a medium that a lot of people are familiar with, but don't really grapple with the nuances of maps. I think maps are so ubiquitous now that everybody has a phone in their pocket. We have Google Maps. We have all these different mapping softwares, and maps have, over the past 20 years, have become so much more integrated in the average person's life. But I think people fail to recognize that because they just pull up maps and then, they pull up Google Maps and they're good to go. I remember when we had to have the GPS in the vehicle. Yes. And I remember before that when we had the large map book in the vehicle, and, that was the way we navigated. But maps have become so much more prominent in people's lives that I think there's this moment where you as a map maker have to kind of, like you said, transcend that and say, hey, this isn't just your everyday map. Like, how can I get to you in a different way? How can I get to you on an emotional level? How can I get to you on a personal level? To your point, right, the more personal and specific you are, the more people care about it, the more people are moved by it. And I think that comes from me kind of as an organizer, the community organizer, as someone who has worked to bring communities together, to fight for justice, to have that sense of pride, right? I think it's all aimed towards the same goal, which is trying to create this collective consciousness that somebody can be proud of, or in other terms where there is an issue, this collective consciousness, like, hey, we have to do something about this. So I think, like, my maps, I really try to use them as organizing tools, as a way for folks to get into the discussion. Because a lot of the discussions that, the Murals in Detroit project is great, but a lot of the discussions that we are trying to have about the Murals in Detroit project, lead to, well, what about gentrification, and what about the prices, and what about the, yes. And so we start to get into conversations that are uncomfortable for folks. When I look at my work about the Black Lives Matter movement and people who have been killed by police and some of the work research I do around that, again, it's a very difficult topic for a lot of people to get into. So, in some way, the map is a nice, pretty, easy visual thing for folks to see and get their attention. And then once you have people's attention, you say, okay, let's talk about what's really going on here. And now as we start to have that conversation, the map becomes a tool, like a organizing tool to kind of get folks on the same page and see the data and then be able to have those deeper conversations to hopefully make change.
Again, it's getting back to, if you can tap into the individual, oh my gosh, all of a sudden there's this tapping into the collective at the same time. That it's like you were saying, it's if you can get them, all of a sudden you have to wrestle with your little cellular role in this giant organism, which is amazing. And too, it reminds me of author Brian McCulloch pointed out something that was so fascinating to me. Was here we are in the internet age, and the whole premise for it was going to be, it's decentralized. You could be anywhere. Distance won't mean anything anymore. Just the opposite. The internet thrives on cartography, depends on it, from delivery to how they're doing your demographics when they scrape your data. All of this stuff is still, there's this kind of simplistic approach to modern technology of like, well, it's just, we just exchange packets and things just whip around through the ether. But it gets back to, oh no, we have to have a common foundation of understanding, and one of the things you can't get past is geography. It is a reality. It's a reality, and it's something that is infused through everything. So yeah, it gets me to this point of saying, like, maps again are always going to be essential. It's just an innate.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's an innate thing.
Absolutely. Maps have always been essential in war, in times of prosperity, through all the centuries. Maps have been there to, whether they were hand drawn and now they're digitized, whatever, but maps have always been a tool. And, you look at certain countries and you look at, especially through war times, I think it's a really good example how countries in the past have used maps for propaganda, right? I think that's a very, very common tool. And, in kind of the similar way, not necessarily with those connotations, but in today's world, maps are a medium to communicate information. And now one of the things that we get into nowadays, as you've seen probably with the recent election and things like that, without even going into any political jargon or anything like that, at the end of the day, we're on election night. We're all looking at a map, and we have 5 different versions of it from 5 different stations, and you're asking yourself, whose map is correct? and
a lot matters.
And it's like, yeah, absolutely,
Yes.
Absolutely. And so many things are so dependent upon where somebody draws a line or how many people are enumerated. That's how redlining started in communities of color, to say, okay, we're not going to, banks and city governments would say, we're not going to lend and we're not going to invest in this area. And the difference of somebody drawing a line on this street or on that street could make the difference between how much access you have to education, how much access you have to upward mobility, how much access you have to healthy food. And it is amazing to see how important maps are in changing people's lives. And so I think, the one thing that I really try to do with my work is harness the power of the map, because maps, just like any other tool, can be used in good or for bad. They could be used and be efficient and factual, or they can be misleading and they can lie to you. And I think for me, I really want to try to harness the power of the map so that folks can feel empowered, so folks can feel like they are seen, right? Because again, when somebody sees themselves on the map, they're like, hey, that's our city. Hey, there we are. That's right. I remember I was there. And there's this feeling of empowerment, this feeling of being seen. And I think that there's a lot of power behind it, especially in this age where more people are making maps. It's really important that we do it intentionally and don't just spin something up that is kind of wonky or kind of, oh yeah, I just slapped this together and let me throw it out there, because In today's age, it'll still get a lot of rotation and likes and et cetera, but there is a responsibility of the map maker to also be an educator in that regard and help people become more map literate and help people be able to critique maps better and say, hey, that doesn't look right. Something doesn't look right, because if we just allow folks to ingest data without being critical, then we're going down a bad path. And it doesn't matter, whether that's with literature, whether that's with, education or anything else. But we need folks to learn how to be critical of the maps that are out there, especially because there's so many on so many of similar topics.
Yes, and amen to Frank Romo. Our thanks to him, and our apologies for this almost criminally edited down version of a discussion with him. We hope to air more in the future too. Thanks so much for listening. Please feel free to contact us at newprojectionscast@gmail.com, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks.